Hello and welcome. How much is excessive commercialism and consumerism destroying the spirit of Ramadan? As a billion-plus Muslims around the world celebrate the traditional Islamic festival, many say it's now become an excuse to make money. During Ramadan, Muslims are expected to abstain from food, drink and sex from dawn to dusk for a month every year. It's considered a period of spiritual reflection when Muslims use discipline to control the most basic needs and urges. It ends with Eid al-Fitr, which is a celebration of gift-giving and feasting, but some fear that many Muslims are losing the true meaning of this religious month. Critics say that Ramadan is now driven by growing consumer demands in the Islamic world, where it's being increasingly marketed as a brand. Today we ask, is the traditional Ramadan message of thrift and discipline being overshadowed by its growing commercial appeal? Remember, you can call in with your questions and comments, and we welcome your SMSs and emails on the show too. Joining me now from Chicago is Muslim comic Azhar Usman. He's co-founder of the popular stand-up show Allah Made Me Funny, the official Muslim comedy tour, which has been seen in more than 20 countries now. With me here on the set is Dr. Vali Nasser, professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy of the Tufts University here in the US. He also speaks extensively on Islamic issues. I welcome you both to the show. Professor Vali Nasser, starting with you, sir. I guess for our audience, those who aren't familiar with Ramadan, let's get some perspective of how important a celebration this is for Muslims.
It's very important because it's one of the articles of Muslim faith. Every Muslim who's not infirm, who's of right age, who's in the right condition is expected to fast for the 30 days of Ramadan. It comes as most important article of the faith after prayer. But it also is an important date on the calendar of Muslim life. So it decides the tempo of a daily activity for an entire month, the way in which cities in the Muslim world, towns, villages, work, operate, the way in which people interact with each other, what they do for a whole month in a year is changed, and in that sense it's much like Christmas, which marks as a parenthesis in the everyday life of Christians around the world. Ramadan has the same function at the social level.
And routines do change as well. For example, in the Middle East, especially in the heat of the day and everything, people's lives invert and become almost night living when they can eat and they can actually do things.
Actually, life in the Muslim world becomes by and large nocturnal, because during the day, not only whether it's summer or not, you cannot drink or eat, but you're also abstain from a lot of different activities. And it's a time, during the daytime, it's a time of contemplation and reflection. But when the fast is broken, it's when people get together, they go out, they celebrate, they live it up in some ways in many parts of the Muslim world.
Why is there a lot of confusion among Muslims as to when exactly, for example, when Ramadan starts sometimes, especially when the Eid holiday at the end, the Eid al-Fitr at the end of Ramadan, the date on which it lands, they always seem to disagree. Why is that?
Well, because it has to be a time when they sight the moon. First of all, the Muslims live across a vast geographical expanse in the world, all the way from California, and then you can go all the way around the world to China. There are Muslims, and therefore citation of the moon can be an issue. Muslims look to their religious leaders to declare when they have sighted the moon, and the religious leaders sometimes use that imperative to assert their own authority. Sometimes between the sects of Islam, hardly ever the Shiites and Sunnis agree on the same Eid al-Fitr, and even within the Sunni community there are disagreements as to when this happened. Sometimes governments want to say when the moon is seen, and the clerics will say, no, you don't get to say that. It is our authority, and when we declare when we see it.
Politics and religion. Well, let me bring in Azhar Usman. Azhar, it's great to talk with you again.
Nice to be here, Riz.
It's interesting that this year Eid celebrations are landing approximately on September the 11th. Now that means a billion-plus Muslims are celebrating on September the 11th. That's going to be a bit of a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, that's an unfortunate calendaring problem, no doubt about it. So
how are we going to get around that?
I was
going to say, how are we going to get around that in America, where there's going to be a lot of sensitivity?
I have no idea, man. I think that the point that Professor Nasser made is extremely valid about the sighting of the moon is the basis for the dispute, and this is relevant to the 9/11, potentially coinciding with Eid. But also within the religion, there's a disagreement on an important legal question, which is, why do we even need to sight the moon anymore? Why can't we just have a calculation, figure out when the moon is actually born and when it's going to appear, and just forecast a calendar accordingly? So now even within this particular these communities, you have a dispute as to whether they should just calculate the calendar. And those who have calculated the calendar, actually I think they're falling on September 10th. So it's going to be interesting to see how the interplay between this obvious international tragedy, rubs against the international holiday that Muslims will be celebrating. I have no idea how we're going to handle it, to be perfectly honest with you. I'm a little bit worried.
Now, it's a source of humor to some degree, but I hear so many Muslims say they actually gain weight during Ramadan. And of course, Ramadan is meant to be a time of fasting. You'd imagine that weight loss might be the more appropriate approach.
Well, people obviously tend to overeat after hours. What's also interesting is there's always a statistic that's quoted about how the amount of meat consumed in the month of Ramadan in the Muslim world is astronomically higher than the rest of the year. But actually the truth behind that number is often the fact that it's also a time of generosity, and people are very giving. So there's a lot of animals being slaughtered in order to feed the poor and share meat with people who don't normally get to eat meat. So there's, you know, both sides of it. People do become a little bit more gluttonous. But of course, there's also a lot more generosity during the month of Ramadan as well.
Well, you know, it may be a personal question, Professor, but do you weigh yourself before, or have you weighed yourself before and after Ramadan and see what effect it has?
No, but
I try to avoid that as a general proposition.
Well, let's see what the professor does then.
Well, you know, the point is actually is interesting. If you look at statistics, during Ramadan, the export of lamb meat from Australia and New Zealand spike up quite drastically. So we have Muslims have an impact on the economy of meat exports from those areas. If you look at Egypt's statistics, Egyptians eat 3 times as much food as a nation during Ramadan than during the rest of the year. And therefore there is no way to get around gaining weight. And largely it has to do because it's expected of Muslims to, when they break their fast, to do it as a community, do it with family members, do it with friends, with neighbors, with people they know. So when the fast is broken, you tend to have many more gatherings, and at gatherings you tend to eat a lot more than you do individually.
Unfortunately, I mean, I lose about 7 pounds, 3 kilos or so, but I seem to gain it very quickly once Ramadan is over. Asad, how does your life change during Ramadan in terms of the routine and the way you celebrate, and or at least hold the fast and everything else?
Sure. Well, I mean, for me personally, I travel quite a bit for my work as a comedian, but I try to really put that on hold during the month of Ramadan. I don't travel very much. I do very minimal amount of stand-up performances. And quite frankly, I try to focus on, as Professor Nasser was saying, family, community, being home, being around people that I love, people that are important to me. And then, of course, the night vigil prayer, the Taraweeh prayer, which is a special prayer that only happens during the month of Ramadan, is a wonderful opportunity. I always try to take advantage of it, to go to the mosque every single night during the month of Ramadan, and literally you get to hear the entire scripture, the entire Quran recited from beginning to end, if you attend every day during the month of Ramadan. For me, that's kind of a wonderful spiritual experience, because throughout the rest of the year, it's very easy to become so distracted by our life and our obligations, our business, our worldly pursuits. Whereas during the month of Ramadan, I think there is something that opens up that allows you to just try to experience something that's a little more spiritual, perhaps connecting you with the divine, so you can get that vertical connection, so for the remaining 11 months you can worry about the horizontal connection.
Well, Professor Nasser, of course, on the downside to some degree is there's a lot of criticism now that Ramadan's become very commercialized. As I mentioned in the open of the show, that it's the focus is on shopping and material things, and it's become less about those spiritual values that it's supposed to promote.
Well, this is actually an interesting criticism, because it's criticism that is also made about Christmas by Christians.
Right.
Namely that Christmas has lost many of its spiritual meaning, and it's all become about gift giving and shopping. But it also suggests that Muslims are part of the world community. They're driven by the same desires of commerce and shopping, as well as spirituality and the life of religion. And commercialism has penetrated the Muslim world in big ways when you look at Dubai, Beirut, Kuala Lumpur, and therefore it's not a surprise that the commercial drive in the Muslim world touches every aspect of their lives, Ramadan included.
Well, let me get a question to you, Professor, that came in from a viewer in the UK with a possible explanation as for why this all happens. Billy Hussein in the UK wrote in saying, Ramadan's commercialism may have something to do with Islam's long tradition of commerce. The Hajj, for example, has been used as an opportunity for individuals to conduct trade.
Well, it has to do with the perception, particularly in the West, that Islam means some form of asceticism. That's not true. I mean, Islam it regulates life in society. The Prophet was himself a businessman. He encouraged commerce. Islam encourages trade and commerce, and therefore it is a given that Muslims embrace commerce. What Islam says is that they should do commerce within certain rules and regulations, and temper it, and not to do excessive things. And therefore there is a criticism when during Ramadan, if there is too much shopping, if there is too much consumption, that then it becomes a criticism.
Azhar, on a sort of contrasting note, if you're in the USA, wrote in with an email, if I can put this to you, they're arguing the opposite. Murtaza Akbar from the USA wrote in saying, consumerism is not dictating the spirit of Ramadan. In fact, the holy month enhances the understanding that material wealth does not lead to a fulfilling life. What do you think?
Well, I think that's important to draw a distinction between commercialism and consumerism, right? I think that the 2 points that have been made by the comments submitted and what Professor Nasser is saying are not actually contradicting one another. Commercialism has to do with just commerce and business, and I think I agree with everything the professor said. What this, I think, comment is talking about is consumerism, which is the mindless consumption of things for the sake of buying more stuff. And that, I think, is a more empty, kind of vacuous pursuit that definitely does lead to, a spiritual disconnectivity, because you're just concerned with just buying up things without any real meaning behind it. I think also, by the way, comparing and contrasting what's happened with Christmas, what's happened with Easter, and what is perhaps happening with Ramadan, I think there's an interesting insight there, because on the one hand, if I were a Christian, it would bother me that, Christmas is more about Santa Claus and Christmas trees than it is about Jesus. Easter is more about the Easter bunny and about, hiding eggs than it is about the resurrection of Jesus, or whatever the theological underpinning of that holiday is. For Muslims, however, Ramadan has not yet been so commercialized, or that we have like a character. So I think I think the Ramadan is safe until we find there's like a Ramadan, like a Ramadan bear or a Ramadan turtle or something. Then I'll be worried when I see the Ramadan bear.
Another quick question.
Then I'll start to get a little more worried.
Azhar, another very quick question, or at least it sort of illustrates what we're talking about. A viewer in Bangladesh wrote in, Aisha Kabir, saying, Bangladesh is one of the poorest countries in the world, but if you look at the shopping malls during Ramadan leading up to Eid, you would think that we are a nation of millionaires. I mean, can we afford Ramadan if it goes on like this?
Well, I mean, I think that people are people, and human beings are human beings. This is as old as the world itself. The fact that some people get a little money and they want to spend it, I think it's wonderful if they want to spend it around Ramadan to buy gifts for people and for their families and friends. I think that's a good thing. I think that encouraging generosity, one of the beautiful things about the Prophet Muhammad is they say, he was so generous, but there was no time when he was more generous than Ramadan. So, this is an example of the Prophet to spend, spend, spend. I think it has more to do with intentionality. If you're just spending for the sake of spending, and as I said, accumulating stuff that is vacuous and meaningless, that's a problem. But if you're spending money and spending your wealth in order to buy good things and share them with people, I see no problem with that.
We'll look more at the economics after this short break. Now, when we return, we'll also see how Ramadan can help to get rid of some myths and negative stereotypes about Islam. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Ramadan is one of the world's biggest religious events. As its reach and influence grows, how can Ramadan serve to bridge Islam with other religions and communities? Well, discussing that with me is Chicago-based Muslim stand-up comedian Azhar Usman and Professor Vali Nasser, who advised the Obama administration on a number of major Islam-related issues. Now, we were talking about the economics before the break, and Professor, I want to get an email to you from Indonesia, from Mushtaq Ahmed Kafre, who wrote in saying, in most Muslim countries, people cannot afford to spend lavishly throughout the years, so they save it for Ramadan. But let's look at some of the figures here, the issue of economics, how there's a major spike in the price of essentials across the Middle East, for example, during Ramadan. In Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates, the price of fruits and vegetables reportedly jumped 25% during Ramadan. Consumers in Egypt are spending 30% more to buy basic food products during Ramadan. And in Yemen, household expenditures have risen by 35%. And so similar stories are being reported in Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and other countries. Qatar actually, ironically, has a price freeze on basic items till the end of Ramadan. So maybe some concern coming in a bit. But surely this kind of price gouging goes against the spirit of Islam and Ramadan.
Yes, it does. But ultimately, Muslims are not impervious to the laws of economics. In other words, when you have demand exceeds supply, or you have a sudden surge in demand of any kind of a good, then there's going to be a reaction in the market, and it does create certain problems. But it's not just because of Ramadan. There is much more effort on advertising, on selling that comes from businesses. For instance, most of the Arab advertising money is spent on television programs during Ramadan, which is to encourage people to shop. There is obviously a competition with the neighbors going on. So, you know, if you have a lavish iftar, which is when the Muslims break their fast, then, you know, your guest would want to have one more lavish or equally lavish as yours. And as a result, you know, people spend most of what they would spend on various sorts of parties and extravaganza during 1 month. It does create certain economic problems. Many countries may face problems of actually importation and exportation. There is bottlenecks that happens because of bazaars cannot handle necessarily the volume. And, you know, we also have to take into account that there are more Muslims in the world than there were before. Right. And the size of the middle class in the Muslim world has actually been expanded. There's a certain degree of wealth in the Muslim world. And that wealth reflects itself in this kind of a demand for goods as well.
Well, let's get a caller on the line from Ghana. Good to hear from Ghana. Atif, thanks for being with us. Thanks for your patience. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hi, go on.
Yeah, my name is Sam from Ghana.
Oh, Sam. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, my question is, I find it strange to understand why is it that Muslims use Ramadan to purify themselves. But yes, still, if I look at what is happening at Gaza Strip just only 2-3 days ago, you continue to kill people. Can you tell me that why are you doing that?
Well, I guess as a, you know, the question from Sam in Ghana is basically, you know, Ramadan is a time for Muslims to purify themselves, and here yet we're seeing, you know, examples of where in the name of Islam there are people committing acts of extremist acts across the world, and I guess that's a comment. I don't know if you have any view on that.
I agree. That's bad. I mean, you know, I don't know how that Ramadan can be held accountable or responsible for people's stupidity and, you know, people's ungodliness. It's an unfortunate reality of the world we live in, and I think the caller is right. I mean, there's a lot of things that become frustrating when people do bad stuff in general, but especially when they do it during Ramadan, Muslims in particular, because, you know, if they have any kernel of belief left in the divine and in reality. One of the core beliefs about Ramadan from a Muslim standpoint for a believer is the fact that during the month of Ramadan, the devils are actually chained up. So any evil that's happening is actually coming from yourself. It's coming from the evil inside you. So if you find yourself actually doing evil things in Ramadan, being sinful, you know, doing horrible things, that's an indictment of something that's wrong with you. Yeah, and you can't blame the devil anymore because Ramadan doesn't give you that out. So I think the caller it makes a valid point. It's very frustrating when you see people in general doing these horrible, evil things in the name of Islam, and then what happens in Ramadan, it's just, you know, it's a double whammy.
Right. We've got an email or an SMS actually that just came in, Professor, if I could put this to you, in response to what you said about the way life changes during Ramadan and the scheduling, I guess, of activities. Our viewer wrote in saying, if Muslims turn the day activities to night, how can that be fasting?
No, you see, the purpose of fasting is to purify one's soul, to assert discipline on your wants and desires for a period of time during the day from dawn to dusk. But Ramadan is not a period where you're supposed to be unhappy, that you're supposed to be turned against the world. In fact, Islam in most ways is a world-embracing religion. And therefore, the two things are not inimical. I mean, this is not asceticism, does not mean that you know, later, once the fast is over, you don't also celebrate all the blessings that God has given to you, and you share with your family, and you want to spread the blessings of the day around. In the Muslim mind, you know, serving you know, the mandate of God during the day is not inimical to celebrating life after the fast. I mean, both complement one another.
So, Professor, how can Islam, or how could Ramadan, I should say, be used as a way to help counter some of the negative stereotypes of Islam? How could it be used as a way for Muslims to say, look, this is what we're about, and this is what you should understand us for, rather than the violent acts of just very few people?
Well, first of all, Ramadan reflects that, you know, when the West talks about jihad in Islam, that the biggest jihad is against one's soul, against one's excessive desires. So Muslims are mandated for 1 month to get control of desires for sex, for aggression, for eating, for drinking, and to bring discipline onto themselves and to focus on what is essentially the purpose of faith. It is also a month during which they're supposed to care about one another and about the poor, which means that Islam is much more about equity, about giving, about sharing, about understanding what those who don't have enough to eat and drink feel for the rest of the year. And it's also a time that, as is reflected in the activities after the iftar, after the breaking of the fast, that you embrace one another. You share your eating with your family, with larger members of the community, that you're not an individual, but you're a member of a society, and that you see or seek God not just in disciplining yourself, but you also seek God in the larger community. And therefore, you know, it shows that you know, the perception that Islam is about a war with the world is not correct. It's first war against yourself and then blessing the community.
Well, let's bring Azhar in on this. You use comedy, don't you, really to help break some of those negative stereotypes, Azhar, and I wonder if Ramadan, again, you can see a function that Ramadan might serve of trying to actually break down some of these stereotypes you certainly, I know, encounter.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it. In fact, one of the things that occurred to me, and again, I hope this is not a heretical statement or a sacrilegious thing for me to point out, but the fact that Muslims fast from dawn to dusk, as the professor was explaining, not only from food and drink, but also from sex, to me, you know, really goes at one of the stereotypes that people have about Muslims, which is that they're somehow, you know, very prudish, and they have this, you know, very negative relationship with sex and sexuality. On the contrary, the fact that the religion is saying you can't have sex from sunrise to sundown sort of gives you an indication that early Muslims were having a lot of afternoon delight, which they had to refrain from. So, and it's very interesting that this is actually an interesting point. You know, they say that historically, you know, European Christendom had two predominant stereotypes about Muslims, classically. One was that they were violent, and the other one was that they were sexually promiscuous. and now that's literally been turned on its head. You know, they're still violent, but now they're sexually prudish. So that's one example, I think, of a stereotype that could be subverted by Ramadan.
So, well, thanks. I hope you're being a good boy, and I thank you very much for being with us as well. And Professor Vali Nasser, great to have you on as well. Thank you both. Thanks for being with us too. You can follow the program on Twitter. Remember, we keep you notified on upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, is it okay to make fun of America's so-called war on terror? The Indian film comedy Tere Bin Laden is doing just that and has become an unexpected success in movie theaters. We'll speak to the stars of that and the director about the message it's trying to send. Make sure you tune for that from me and the team. We'll see you next time.